Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Ranta, and I live in Rockport, Massachusetts. And I'm a survivor of domestic and gun violence, a national advocate and activist, and author of Killing Kate, a story of turning abuse and tragedy into transformation and triumph. Today is tough. While we celebrated yesterday's passage of the most significant legislation addressing guns in nearly 30 years, we have a double whammy from the extremist Supreme Court striking down New York's concealed carry law this morning and its overturning of Roe versus Wade. So I'm feeling pretty somber and sad today as I share my story of domestic and gun violence for the People's Filibuster. Please excuse my note reading. With PTSD, it's very hard for me to speak off the cuff unless I'm being interviewed. So my notes kind of help keep me on track with the story. I met my abusive ex-husband on an online dating site back in 2007. I was a single mom with a 3-year-old son. When I saw his profile, I noticed that he was a captain in the Air Force. I had never dated anyone in the military before, but him being an officer and well-educated vetted him for me. In America, we view our military service members as brave and honorable, right? And he also had high security clearances, so I figured that was a good sign of stability too. Our courtship was fast, too fast. He asked me to move in with him only after 3 months of dating and asked me to marry him 3 months later. And I also became pregnant. But I didn't see that as a red flag at the time. I thought that we were both on sort of the same life track and that we wanted to be married and have a family. So the quickness of it didn't really ring any bells for me. He really did sweep me off my feet, and I felt like I'd hit the jackpot with this guy. One thing that really sticks out in the beginning was the guns in his house. I'm not someone who has been around guns. My parents were both educators. We didn't have guns in the home. I didn't really know anybody growing up or even into adulthood who owned guns or even hunted. So I was kind of out of my territory at that point. But I figured that he was in the military for over 20 years at that point, and he was around guns for his job. And he also told me how he grew up hunting with his dad. So it was a cultural thing. I mean, that's kind of how I looked at it. And I thought, okay, well, I can deal with this. He had a gun cabinet filled with antique rifles. He also had multiple shotguns, one of which was under the bed. I wasn't comfortable with that at all, especially having moved in with a young son. He also had many, many handguns. At that point, I wasn't really well educated on gun safety and locking up guns, but I guess I had enough common sense just to ask him to get trigger locks for the guns. And it was weird. He resisted at first because he wanted the shotgun under the bed unlocked because what if an intruder came in and he had to blow the guy away? So there was a difficult conversation, but he wound up getting those locks because I insisted on it. But as the relationship progressed, his controlling and abusive behavior began to escalate. He moved us to a military base in Virginia where I was isolated from my local friends in the DC area. He was supposed to check all of those guns in on the base. They're not allowed to have guns in their houses on base, but he didn't do that, and nobody ever checked on it. He kept them in the master bedroom closet. By this time, he'd removed all the trigger locks. That just went out the door. And he would take his guns out and clean them in front of me. He would take them out and line them up on the bed and take them apart in front of me, knowing my discomfort. And I subsequently learned later that that was definitely an act of abuse and control, showing the guns and playing with the guns. He also used to take the laser on the gun, on his handgun, and play with it against the wall, and just not good gun safety. He would laugh about it. Fast forward to our move to Florida from Virginia. That's where things really unraveled with him. His power and control over me escalated to the point that he threatened to punch me in the face and kidnapped our then 4-year-old or 2-year-old son. He was 2, leaving the home with him. I told the operator that I heard the chambering of a gun coming from the bedroom before he left. So he had locked himself in the bedroom. He had picked a fight with me, and I was standing at the bedroom door trying to get him to talk to me, and I heard ch-ch. And so that's what caused me to call 911. And then he subsequently went into our son's room and grabbed him and took him out of the crib and got in the car. I jumped in the car with them, and I begged him to give me back the baby. He pulled over on the side of the road, and he raised his fist, and he told me to get out of the car. He ordered me to get out of the car. I did as he said, and he tore off down the street with our son. I ran through the streets of my neighborhood screaming and screaming for help. Not one person came out of their house. Granted, it was the middle of the night, but I was screaming very, very loudly. So I find it hard to believe that nobody could hear me. Not knowing what else to do, I ran back to my house, and there he was with the cops, buddying up to them and giving him these military coins that he had. In the military, they have like unit coins that they trade and collect, and he had a whole bunch of them. And he had gone back to the house with our son, got him back in the crib, and grabbed a bunch of these coins to like give to the cops to, I guess, impress them. And I could hear him talking about how he was this war veteran, even though that wasn't true because he had never seen combat. So they were all like enamored with him, and I looked like the hysterical wife. But one cop did pull me aside and urged me to go get a restraining order the next day. He had said that if he didn't hit me this time, he would hit me the next time that he'd seen it enough, and that I should go get a restraining order. And so that's what I did. I was granted a temporary restraining order, and police were able to remove the guns that were in the home once they served him. And so I believe they retrieved, it was a long list of guns, and there were guns that I didn't even realize about until I saw a list later on. But I felt relieved, obviously, that they were able to take all of those guns. But then at the next turn, a cop told me that even though they took the guns that were in the home, that my ex could still go out the next day and legally buy another gun. So you're granted a temporary, this was in Florida, you're granted a temporary restraining order. Police are able to go retrieve the guns that are in the home in order to keep the women and children safe. But because it's a temporary restraining order and there's no domestic violence conviction, there's absolutely nothing stopping an abuser who's been served a temporary restraining order, had his guns removed, and is angry to go get a gun the next day. So that's remains to this day a gaping loophole in our gun laws, and it still hasn't been addressed. You need a conviction in order to remove these guns permanently, and it's just not happening. The next year and a half was a traumatic experience of me trying to extricate myself from this man and this marriage, and to keep my son and me safe. Unfortunately, after doing what everybody tells women in domestic violence situations, they always tell you just to leave. Well, I did just leave, and actually things escalated and got worse after I left. I was never granted a permanent restraining order. Our judge just kept extending the temporary, and he would say to my abuser and me that we would have to figure out a civil way to interact with each other since we shared a child. So that was the reason he didn't make it permanent. Every time I went in, I asked for a permanent restraining order because I feared for my life. And he wouldn't listen, and he basically blamed both of us for not being able to communicate. My ex began stalking me. He broke into our marital home when I was living in it. I moved into another apartment. He broke into that apartment. He vandalized my and my dad's cars. He was incessantly texting and emailing me with threats to take my son away from me. Nothing stopped him. I reported all of it, and nothing was able to stop him, and nobody ever did anything about it. Then on November 2nd, 2012, after moving into yet another new apartment and not giving him the address, my worst fears came to reality. I found that my car tire had been slashed with a knife, and I knew he had found me. I called my dad, and I called the police, who arrived at the same time. I told the young female police officer about the history of domestic violence and of his stalking, and she asked me if I had a restraining order. And I said no, that I had been turned down for 3. And she said that there was nothing that she could do because I couldn't prove that it was he who had slashed the tire. She gave me a record number and she left. She didn't ask for his description, for a description of his car. She didn't offer to look around the premises and see if he was there, even to give me a heads up. Nothing. She just drove away. So I went back into the apartment and my dad went to leave. And as he walked out the door, he turned to me and he said, "Katie, call 911. Tom is here." I looked into the parking lot and I could see that his car was pulled up next to mine, and I saw the dome light come on and I saw him. My dad offered to stay outside while I went inside, and I just had a not great feeling about the situation. I didn't want him to have to confront my ex, and so I asked him to come inside with me. And by the time we got back into the apartment and behind the door, my ex was on the other side trying to push in the door and trying to come into the apartment. And my dad and I were both on the other side of the door pushing back against it. And then suddenly 3 shots rang out. We didn't even know he had a gun until that moment. The bullets penetrated the door and hit both my dad and me. And my then 4-year-old son was standing directly behind us. So any of those bullets could have hit him, but thankfully they didn't. This was an ambush. This was nothing that we could have prepared for. We had no idea that this was going to happen. It happened in a heartbeat. My ex forced his way in, and then he shot again, and that bullet went right through my right hand. So it exploded in front of my face. And then he went over to my dad, and I heard boom, and he shot him directly. I heard a grunt, and I thought he had killed my dad. I remember lying in a pool of my own blood and just screaming and begging him not to do this. He asked me why I took his stuff. So he wasn't saying the typical things that abusive men say to their victims. He wasn't saying, "I don't want this divorce," or, "I just want to see my son," or, "If I can't have you, nobody will." He wasn't saying that. He was saying, "Why did you take my stuff?" And so he meant the furniture from our home that I had taken, that I had paid for, and I had taken in order to move into my new apartment. And he yelled, "Was it worth it? Was it worth it, you bitch?" And I apologized and told him I'd return everything, and just kept screaming and begging him not to do it. And then all of a sudden, my 4-year-old son screamed out, "Don't do it, Daddy, don't shoot Mommy." And I heard my ex move behind me toward the kitchen. So keep in mind, I had called 911 at the beginning of all of this, and I was on the phone with the operator the entire time. So the cops knew the situation. They knew what was going on in the apartment. They knew there was a shooter and that people had been shot, yet they did not come to save us. much like we saw in Parkland and Uvalde. Obviously, my situation was far less people, but nonetheless, it was me and my family, and we were hostage, and the cops were there and did nothing. They didn't come kick in the door and take out the bad guy and get us to safety. It wasn't anything like you see on TV or in the movies. We were just there. It was 20 minutes long. My ex finally said, "Kate, just go." And I took a chance and I went out the door. The door was a little bit open, and my thought was, since the cops weren't coming in to save me, I just needed to get out. I was I could tell physically I was in bad shape. I was lost a lot of blood, and I needed to get out of there. I thought he would actually shoot me in the back of the head as I left, but that didn't happen. I went out the door and fell to the ground. The cops did not come over to me. They yelled and asked if I could get over to them. And I said, "Well, no, I'm dying. Somebody come get me," but nobody did. And then my dad came out a minute later with my son, William. And it was the first time that all of us realized that we were all actually alive. My dad, as he left, my ex told my dad that I was gone. So my dad didn't look and thought that I was laying there dead. And then when he shot my dad and I heard my dad grunt, I thought he was dead. So we had this moment out there where we realized that we all had actually survived, at least for the moment, these gunshots. We got over to the police, and it was there that we learned that not only my hand, but I had actually been hit through my left breast. Actually, we didn't know it had gone through it in that moment. We just saw that there was a chest wound and I was bleeding profusely. We knew I was in trouble. My dad had been hit in his left arm, and then the point blank was actually in his left side. And it was assessed that he could be rushed by ambulance to the trauma unit. And then I was in such trouble that a helicopter actually came for me. I remember laying on the ground and waiting to hear the shot, that they had shot the bad guy, but that never happened. He surrendered. He surrendered at the scene peacefully. So the legal outcome of all of this was that we went to trial. It took almost 5 years for us to go to trial. He pled not guilty, but the jury didn't buy what the defense was selling, and he was convicted on all 5 counts against him, the 2 most serious including 2 counts of premeditated attempted first-degree murder against my dad and me, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. So he will die behind bars, which is where he belongs, and as he should. My case for domestic violence is very rare. Most victims of domestic violence, they see their attempted murderers maybe get 15, 20, 25 years. So, in my case, justice was served, but unfortunately, too often these guys get off easy and they get their guns back afterwards. So while I'm happy that the gun legislation that passed in the Senate yesterday includes the boyfriend loophole and red flag laws, boyfriend loophole is something I've talked about at national press conferences and various other places for a long time. It's kind of a no-brainer. But it's just the tip of the iceberg that's needed to keep women and children safe from abusers. To me, if a man shows that he's capable of abusing and harming the person that he purports to love, his wife, his partner, however that relationship looks, and or children that are involved in that relationships, then he should be stripped of his guns. Like, it's that simple. There shouldn't be any gray area. I don't understand the gray area here. These men also prove that they're dangers to society at large. Look at the mass shooters. Sandy Hook, Vegas, Parkland, many of the others, they all have violence against women in their pasts, all of them. That's a connection that cannot continue to be overlooked. If we start to better address violence against women and disarming abusers, I think that we might start to chip away at less mass shootings. Additionally, 57% of mass shootings in this country are domestic violence shootings, meaning an abuser shows up like he did with us, shoots his wife, shoots the children, shoots himself, and there you have a mass shooting. That's more than half of the mass shootings in this country. We've just got to address that intersection of domestic and gun violence. I believe we need to just keep pressing forward. I'm happy that after 30 years, we did see some movement, but I mean, we need much stronger consequences for abusive men. Congress needs to do more there. I want to thank the People's Filibuster for creating this important forum to elevate our voices. Survivors, in my opinion, are the power in this movement, and our stories matter. And I just hope that in my lifetime, I see more around taking guns away from domestic abusers. Thank you.